He didn't place any men on Loudon Heights because, in his opinion, it would be impossible to drag cannon up there, and he also thought that as long as they had the high ground of Maryland Heights, it didn't matter whether they had Loudon Heights. Obviously, this was a huge gamble. And on the 13th of September, the Confederates were behind schedule. Lee had hoped to finish his whole plan here at Harper's Ferry by the 12th. That hadn't happened, but they were still going through with it. So early on the 13th, McLaws and his men began advancing up Maryland Heights, where they would meet the untested 126th New York alongside two veteran federal units. The 126th New York had been in the Army less than a month, but the federal troops put up a determined resistance for most of the morning. Chaos swept through the lines when Colonel Sherrill, the leader of the 126th New York, was wounded through the jaw and could no longer rally his men. They scattered for a second, moved back to a second line of defenses, but continued to fight. Colonel Thomas Ford, who was the leader of the Union troops on the heights, asked Miles for more men, but he was denied. And so they continued to fight for most of the day, but around 3:30, for some reason, we don't really know why, the orders were given to retreat. Well, the men on Maryland Heights thought that that must be a mistake. There was no way that those were their orders. One soldier who was up there wrote about it later, saying that they wouldn't have been more surprised had the orders been to surrender completely. So the orders had to be given 3 times until the men would finally retreat from Maryland Heights and give the Confederates the high ground, and this would earn themselves the nickname of the Cowards of Harper's Ferry. Also on the morning of the 13th, in a clover field, an Indiana corporal found an envelope, and in that envelope were 3 cigars wrapped in a piece of paper. On that piece of paper were Lee's orders, Special Orders 191. The lost orders, as they're now called, were passed up to Lee's Union opposite, General George McClellan, and this gave McClellan a clear picture of the division of Lee's army. No Civil War general had ever had a better chance at defeating an enemy army before they could reunite, and McClellan would write to one of his friends about that, saying that this is a piece of paper with which, if I can outwit Bobby Lee, I will willingly go home. But Miles knew nothing about this. He knew that McLaws now had the high ground on Maryland Heights. Jackson and his men were in place on Schoolhouse Ridge, and he didn't know this, but Walker and his men were making their way up Loudon Heights. Miles would send some cavalrymen for help that night, and he would tell them, when anyone in the United States Army, anyone who knows anything about the United States Army, anyone who's ever heard about the United States Army, and communicate to McClellan the state of Harper's Ferry. If we don't get help within 48 hours, we will be forced to surrender. So by the end of the day on the 13th, to Miles, things looked pretty bleak. But to Jackson, the Union on Bolivar Heights still looked like one of the strongest defended garrisons that he had come up against. They had the high ground compared to Jackson and his men on Schoolhouse Ridge by about 200 feet, and that was covered by vertical bluffs, which made a straightforward advance by Jackson and his men almost impossible. They had cannon on Bolivar Heights that could sweep over half a mile of open ground. They had better interior lines for communication and supplies than the Confederates did, and they also had the rivers on either side, which made changing positions quickly very difficult. And to Jackson, this seemed good chances for the Union. But by 10 a.m. on the 14th, Walker had done what Miles thought was impossible. He had dragged cannons up to the crest on Loudon Heights. Some of the men on Bolivar Heights would comment on that, saying, "We watched as our shell crawled lazily up towards them, never seeming to reach them, and asked ourselves, could it be possible, had they succeeded in dragging guns up there?" Well, they would find out later that they had succeeded when the Confederates opened fire and the Union troops on Bolivar Heights were bombarded from all 3 directions. Jackson on Schoolhouse Ridge, McLaws on Maryland Heights, and Walker on Loudon Heights. The bombardment would last all day. Colonel Trimble of the 60th Ohio, who was there on Bolivar Heights, would write about it, saying that there was no place where you could lay the palm of your hand and say that it was safe. There were some ravines dug across Bolivar Heights that allowed the Union troops some protection, but that was really hard on their morale. It was one thing to fight, that roused your courage, but it was completely another thing to sit there and be asked to be a mark for artillery. So this is an understatement, but the 14th was a really bad day for the Union troops here. However, it was also a bad day for the Confederate troops. They had lost a big battle at South Mountain, which is just past Maryland Heights, and McClellan had begun his movements. By that night, a release force was only 6 miles away, but Miles didn't know this. Around 8 p.m., he would send his cavalry under Benjamin Grimes Davis, who was originally a Mississippi native, to escape through Confederate lines, and this was for 2 reasons. One, another attempt to find help